When you're practicing intermittent fasting, you can do it a couple of different ways. You can just limit the number of meals, or you can have an eating window. In today's video, we'll talk about the pros and cons of each. So I've done intermittent fasting for several years now, and I've practiced it a lot of different ways. And the good thing about intermittent fasting is it's very flexible. The bad part of intermittent fasting is it's very flexible, and sometimes it can be kind of overwhelming. And a thing that can seem overwhelming at first is how exactly to implement it into your life. But there are a couple of different philosophies. One is just to have an eating window and a fasting window, and just break up your days like that. Or you can just limit the number of meals you have per day. And I've done it both ways. You know, when I first started out with intermittent fasting, I just did windows. I just said, okay, I'm gonna fast between this hour, these hours, and then I'm gonna eat between these hours. And over time though, I eventually got to the point where I was just eating one meal a day. And so over the course of time during maintenance, I've also experimented with going back to windows versus, just having a certain number of meals each day. So first let's talk about the eating window and fasting window, just setting your day up like that. Because that's really the most well-known way, I would say, that people practice intermittent fasting. So let's say, for example, you wanted to practice a 16-8. That just means that you are fasting for 16 hours and your eating window is open for 8 hours. So this is pretty easy to implement in your life. Basically you have such a long eating window that it doesn't really feel too different from perhaps what you're doing already. Although I will say, that was not true in my case. I started out with a very, very short fasting window because I was not used to going long periods of time between food at all. So I started out with something like a 8 or 10 hour fasting window and just slowly pushed it out. But the point is, when you have an 8-hour eating window, you could theoretically maybe have like 3 meals during that time. So it's not very different when you think about how many meals and the types of foods you may be eating. And so having windows can be really good for people who like smaller portions because when you get into just having a certain number of meals, it's going to be bigger portions. But there are some definite cons with just having a fasting window and an eating window. One really big one is that you can end up just eating the same amount of food, the same number of calories as you would any other time. Because, if you have, so let's say an 8-hour eating window and, when it opens up, you start eating and you're snacking and you're just eating and eating and eating, you can easily gain weight or, at least not lose any weight while doing that with perfect consistency. And it can be a pain to recalculate the windows. A lot of times when people are practicing intermittent fasting, they recalculate the time based on the time that they ate their last meal. Then they're gonna, if they're doing a 16-8, they're gonna say, okay, I stopped eating at 7 o'clock. Now what's 16 hours from that? That's the time that I can have my first food tomorrow. And to me, that just gets really stressful, trying to recalculate these things. One tip to make that a little bit easier is if you do go the route of having a fasting window and eating window, just keeping it at the same time each day really can simplify your life. Another downside of having windows is that there's just more variables to look at if you're having trouble losing weight. Because you may be eating so many times during the day, you're sticking to the window, but you're just eating more frequently, it can be a little bit more challenging to figure out exactly what the problem is. Is it portion size? Is it frequency? There's just more to look at. So now let's talk about just limiting the number of meals that you have per day. Now, generally speaking, when people are talking about intermittent fasting, this would be either 2 meals a day or 1 meal a day. And 1 meal a day is really what I prefer, but I've also practiced 2 meals a day, and I like it too. I think some of the biggest advantages of doing this is it's just so much easier to think about and to really know if you're doing the plan or not. There are just fewer variables. It's really easy to know. Like if you're doing OMAD, did I eat just once today? Or did I eat more than once? Or, if you're doing 2 meals a day, did I eat twice today or did I not? And because you're limiting the variables so much, then it's easier to just look at those, that 1 meal or those 2 meals to focus in on, are you eating too fast? Are you eating too much? And that kind of thing. And by limiting the number of meals, you're also cutting out snacking completely. And to me, this is important because what I found in my own life was that snacking was linked directly to stress eating. And this is something I just kind of came to gradually with intermittent fasting. I started to see like when I wanted to snack was generally because I was stressed out about something. And so then when I saw that pattern with myself, I started to see like, it's probably just not a good idea to snack in general. And so then what I found was I really do prefer, if I'm going to do intermittent fasting, to just say, okay, I'm going to just do two meals a day, or just, 1 meal a day. But this approach does have some downside. The first one is it can feel too rigid. And, especially, if you're in a situation where your life just doesn't fit well with just having 2 meals a day, then this probably won't work well for you. In those cases, just having the window may be a better fit. And depending on how you place your meals, it might happen that you really aren't practicing intermittent fasting. Like I could imagine you might have kind of like a 12-hour eating window. Maybe you would wake up at like 6 and eat right then, and then maybe you would eat at 6 p.m. So that's not a very long fasting window. Most people say, 14 to 16 hours, that's really where most people get more benefit. And I think this is simply because then the meals are closer together. And it's just hard to eat too many calories as the meals get closer and closer together. So like if your meals are, that far apart, it might be that you really can eat too much at each of those meals because you're really hungry for each of those meals, and then you end up, either gaining weight or just staying the same. And this really comes down to just an individual thing, I think. So if you find that you're just having trouble losing weight eating 2 meals a day, it might be helpful to try to put the meals a little bit closer together in the day so that your appetite doesn't have quite as much time to build up for that second meal. So at the end of the day, there is no best way to practice intermittent fasting. There are some ways that are going to work great for some people and not so great for other people. And I think just looking at your options, and if you find that you've been practicing it one way and it's just not quite working, then I would encourage you to try the opposite way. See if maybe if you've been doing an eating window and that's just not quite working, switch over to just limiting the number of meals per day. And vice versa, if the number of meals a day feels a bit too rigid and you're starting to resent it, always listen to resentment and just switch over and try out an eating window, because that can feel a lot easier. The main thing is to do what works in your life that gives you results. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.